I left for Vermont on a Friday morning. A week at Robert's house, my half-brother, the one who sends me a letter every month and drives 6 hours to help with a porch. I had been planning the trip for 2 months. Lucas knew about it. Nicole knew about it. Everyone knew I would be gone from Friday to the following Saturday. What I did not tell anyone was that I came back on Wednesday, 3 days early, not because something went wrong in Vermont, because something felt wrong at home. I cannot explain it more precisely than that. 63 years of paying attention to things produces a particular instinct. The instinct said, "Go home." I drove for 4 hours. I turned onto Birchwood Lane at 2:17 in the afternoon. There was a car in my driveway I did not recognize. A woman standing at my front door with a clipboard. A second woman photographing my garden with a professional camera. I parked on the street. I sat for a moment. Then I understood what I was looking at. A real estate agent. In my garden. Photographing my lavender. While I was supposed to be in Vermont. I picked up my phone. I did not call Lucas. I called Patricia. I said, "I need you to listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 63 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher. I own a house on Birchwood Lane. I have owned it for 31 years. The deed is in my name. The mortgage was paid off 18 years ago. The property taxes are current. The trust structure has been reviewed and updated by Patricia 4 times in the past 3 years. There is no ambiguity about who owns this house. There never has been. Let me tell you about the Vermont trip. Robert called me in October. He said, "Eleanor, come for a week. Miriam will be here. We have not all been in the same place since the summer." Robert is my half-brother. I found him 3 years ago through circumstances I still find improbable. He drives 6 hours to help with a porch. He sends me a letter every month. He and his wife have a house in Vermont with a guest room that gets good morning light. I said, "Yes, I will come in November." I booked the week, the second week of November, Friday to Saturday. I told Lucas at Sunday dinner 3 weeks before. I said, "I am going to Vermont for a week. Robert and Miriam. I leave Friday the 8th. Lucas said, "That sounds good. Mom, you need a break." I noted the particular quality of his response. Not the warmth of a son who is happy his mother is taking a trip. The relief of a man who has just received information he needed. I noted it. I said nothing. I told Nicole the following Sunday. She said, "How nice! A whole week! We will check on the house while you are gone." I said, "That is kind. The house will be fine." She said, "We insist. We will keep an eye on things." I noted that too. They insisted before I asked. People who intend to look after something offer when the moment arises. People who have a plan for the empty house volunteer immediately. I said, "Thank you." I called Patricia that evening. I said, "I am going to Vermont for a week in November. I want you to be aware of that." Patricia said, "Aware in what sense?" I said, "Aware in the sense that if anything arrives connected to the Birchwood Lane property while I am away, I want to know immediately." She said, "You are expecting something." I said, "I am expecting the possibility of something. That is different." She said, "I will set up monitoring." I said, "The usual alert system." She said, "And Margaret?" I said, "Yes, tell Margaret as well." I drove to Vermont on Friday the 8th. Robert's house was everything it always is. Warm, quiet, good morning light in the guest room. Miriam arrived Saturday afternoon with her husband and her particular gift for cooking things that take all day and fill a house with the kind of smell that makes time move differently. We talked, we ate, we took walks along the road that follows the river. We sat on Robert's porch in the November cold with blankets and coffee and the particular ease of people who have arrived at each other late in life and are grateful for the arrival. On Monday evening, my phone rang. Margaret. She said, "Eleanor, I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I received an inquiry this morning from a real estate firm in Hartford. They requested a property assessment for Birchwood Lane. Preliminary market evaluation. The request came through a third party. I said, "Which third party?" She said, "A LLC, registered 2 months ago. The registered agent is a man named Gregory Marsh." Gregory Marsh, Lucas's business partner, the man whose wedding invoice had arrived with my name on it 6 months ago. I said, "Margaret, what is a preliminary market evaluation used for?" She said, "Typically for sellers who want to understand value before listing." I said, "Or for buyers who want to understand what they are acquiring." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Eleanor, do you want me to respond to the inquiry?" I said, "Not yet. Give me until tomorrow morning." I sat on Robert's porch that evening with my coffee going cold. I thought about Lucas saying, "That sounds good, Mom. You need a break." I thought about Nicole saying, "We insist. We will keep an eye on things." I thought about Gregory Marsh, ALLC, registered 2 months ago. I thought about the pattern. Then I called Patricia. I said, "I am coming home Wednesday." She said, "I thought you were there until Saturday." I said, "I am coming home Wednesday. I need you available Thursday morning." She said, "I will be there." I said, "And Patricia, do not respond to the real estate inquiry. Do not acknowledge it. Let it sit." She said, "Understood." I said, "I want to arrive before they do. If you have ever had an instinct that something was wrong at home and you were right, stay with me, because what I found in my driveway on Wednesday afternoon was only the beginning. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week." I parked on the street at 217. The real estate agent at my front door had not seen me yet. She was a woman in her 40s. Professional, dark coat, clipboard with what appeared to be a printed property specification sheet. The second woman with the camera was moving through my garden with the focused attention of someone doing a job correctly. She photographed the lavender. My lavender. The lavender Linda Marsh trimmed every Tuesday with the care of someone who understands that a garden is not decoration. I sat in my car and I watched for 4 minutes. I counted. In 4 minutes, the photographer moved from the garden to the front of the house. She photographed the facade, the door, the windows, the oak tree on the left side that Richard had planted in 1991 and that is now taller than the house. The agent made notes on her clipboard. Neither of them knew I was there. I called Patricia from the car. I said, "There is a real estate agent at my front door and a photographer in my garden." Patricia said, "I will send the letter immediately." I said, "Give me 10 minutes first." I got out of the car. I walked up the path. The agent looked up when she heard my footsteps. She said, "Oh, hello. I am sorry. Is this your property?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I am from Hartford Property Associates. We received a request for a preliminary assessment of this property. I understood the owner was away this week." I said, "The owner came home early." She looked at her clipboard. She said, "I apologize for the intrusion. We were told the property would be available for exterior assessment this week. Our client indicated they had authorization." I said, "Who is your client?" She said, "I am not able to disclose that without—" I said, "The client gave you authorization to assess a property they do not own. They told you the owner was away. They were wrong on both counts. I would like the name of your client, please." She looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "The request came through a company called Birchwood Development, LLC." I said, "And who contacted you on behalf of that LLC?" She said, "A Mr. Lucas Brooks." The garden was very quiet. The photographer had stopped moving. I said, "Thank you. I would like you and your colleague to leave my property now." She said, "Of course. I apologize, Mrs." I said, "Brooks, Eleanor Brooks, the owner of record." They left within 2 minutes. I stood on my front path and watched them drive away. Then I went inside. I walked through every room. Nothing had been touched inside. The house was exactly as I had left it on Friday morning. The kitchen, the living room, my bedroom, my mother's mirror above the dresser. Nothing moved. They had only gotten as far as the exterior. I had come home before they finished. I made coffee. I called Patricia. I said, "Send the letter now." She said, "To Lucas or to the LLC?" I said, "Both, and to Hartford Property Associates confirming that no assessment of this property has been authorized and requesting that they cease all activity connected to this address." Patricia said, "Done by 5 o'clock." I said, "Good." I said, "Also, find out everything about Birchwood Development LLC, registration date, directors, registered agent, everything." She said, "Margaret already started this morning when the inquiry came in." I said, "Of course she did." I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee. Lucas called at 4:43. He said, "Mom, are you still in Vermont?" I said, "No." Silence. Lucas said, "You came home early." I said, "Yes." He said, "When did you—" I said, 2:17 this afternoon." He said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." He said, "The real estate agent." I said, "Yes." He said, "She was there when you arrived." I said, "She was photographing my lavender when I arrived." He said, "Mom, I can explain." I said, "I know you can. Come tonight, 7 o'clock. Bring Nicole." He said, "Nicole doesn't—" I said, "Bring Nicole, Lucas." He said, "Okay." He said, "Mom, how much do you know?" I said, "Enough. Come at 7. They arrived at 6:58. Together, Lucas in front, Nicole 2 steps behind, with the expression of a woman who has spent the afternoon deciding how to position herself and has not arrived at a conclusion. I had set the table. Not for dinner. 3 chairs, 3 glasses of water, the folder in the center. They sat down. I sat across from them. I said, "I am going to tell you what I know. Then I am going to tell you what Patricia knows. Then you are going to tell me what actually happened." Lucas said, "Okay." I said, "On Monday morning, Margaret received a preliminary market evaluation request for Birchwood Lane from Hartford Property Associates. The request came through a company called Birchwood Development LLC, registered 2 months ago. The registered agent is Gregory Marsh." Nicole looked at her hands. I said, "This afternoon, Hartford Property Associates sent an agent and a photographer to my property. They had been told the owner was away until Saturday. They had been told they had authorization." Lucas said, "Mom." I said, "The agent confirmed the request came from Birchwood Development LLC and that the LLC contact was a Mr. Lucas Brooks." Silence. I said, "Now, tell me what actually happened." Lucas put both hands flat on the table. He said, "Gregory came to me 6 weeks ago. He said he had a buyer interested in the Birchwood Lane property, a developer, someone who had been looking at properties in that area for a mixed-use project. Gregory said the offer would be significant, that it would be life-changing for both of us." I said, "Both of you?" Lucas said, "The arrangement was that Gregory and I would—" He stopped. He said, "We would facilitate the transaction. As intermediaries, there would be a commission." I said, "You were going to sell my house and take a commission." Lucas said, "I told myself I was going to talk to you, before it went too far. I told myself I just needed to understand the numbers first." I said, "But you did not talk to me." He said, "No." I said, "You registered an LLC with Gregory's name on it." He said, "Yes." I said, 2 months ago." He said, "Yes." I said, "And you sent a real estate agent to photograph my property while I was supposed to be in Vermont." He said, "Yes." I said, "Nicole." She looked up. I said, "When did you know?" She said, 3 weeks ago." I said, "And?" She said, "I told him not to. I told him it was wrong. He said it was just a preliminary step, that he would talk to you before anything real happened." I said, "And you accepted that?" She said, "I should not have. I know that." I said, "Yes. If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever come home to find someone had made plans for something that was yours, leave me a comment. Tell me what you found. I read every single one. I opened the folder, 3 documents, one for each of them. I placed one in front of Lucas, one in front of Nicole. I kept the third. Lucas looked at the document. It was 4 pages. Patricia's letterhead, the property address at the top. Page 1 was a timeline. Every date, every action. The LLC registration 2 months ago. The Margaret inquiry flag 3 weeks ago. The real estate assessment request on Monday. The photographer in the garden today at 2:17. Page 2 was a legal summary. Unauthorized attempt to facilitate sale of protected property. Potential breach of fiduciary duty. The specific legal exposure of Birchwood Development LLC and its principals. Page 3 was a letter to Gregory Marsh, formal, from Patricia's office, notifying him that the property at Birchwood Lane was not available for sale, assessment, or any transaction facilitated by Birchwood Development LLC or any associated party, notifying him that further contact with any real estate firm regarding this property would result in immediate legal action. Page 4 was a single paragraph. It said, "The property owner reserves all rights regarding this matter and will determine next steps at her sole discretion." Lucas read all 4 pages. Nicole read all 4 pages. When they finished, the table was quiet. Lucas said, "You had this prepared." I said, "Patricia had the framework prepared. She filled in the dates and specifics this afternoon while I was making coffee." He said, "You came home Wednesday because you knew." I said, "I came home Wednesday because something felt wrong. Margaret confirmed what that something was on Monday evening. I drove home Tuesday night and arrived Wednesday afternoon." He said, "You drove 4 hours." I said, "Yes." He said, "To get here before we finished." I said, "Yes." He said, "Mom, the developer, the offer." I said, "Tell me." He said, $4.2 million. The kitchen was very quiet. $4.2 million. I looked at my son. I said, "Lucas, do you know what this house is?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Tell me." He said, "It is where I grew up." I said, "Yes." He said, "It is where Dad planted the oak tree." I said, "Yes." He said, "It is yours." I said, "Yes, it is mine." He said, $4.2 million is, I said, "A number, yes. It is a significant number. I am aware of what it is." He said, "And?" I said, "And it does not change what this house is. Numbers do not change what things are. They only change how people who have forgotten what things are think about them." He was quiet. I said, "Lucas, I want to ask you something directly." He said, "Yes." I said, "If I had stayed in Vermont until Saturday, what was the plan?" He said, "We were going to present it to you as an opportunity, the assessment, the developer's interest, the number. We were going to show you the research and the projections and make the case that this was," I said, "a practical solution." He said, "Yes." I said, "The same words Nicole used 4 years ago when she suggested I move to a retirement community." He closed his eyes. I said, "Practical solution, equitable structure, life-changing opportunity." The words change, the approach does not. He said, "I know." Nicole said, "Eleanor, I want to say something." I looked at her. She said, "I told him not to. 3 weeks ago, when he told me about the LLC and Gregory and the developer, I told him it was wrong. I told him it was your house and your decision, and that going behind your back was not acceptable." I said, "Yes, you told me that." She said, "And I did not do enough to stop it." I said, "No, you did not." She said, "I thought—" She stopped. She said, "I thought if the offer was big enough you would say yes, that the number would make it acceptable, that I could be the one who supported the idea once it was presented, and you would not know I had known for 3 weeks. I said, "But I came home early." She said, "Yes." I said, "And now you are sitting at my kitchen table, having not stopped it, and having planned to support it once it was presented." She said, "Yes." I said, "That is the honest version." She said, "Yes, that is the honest version." I looked at both of them. My son, who had registered an LLC with his business partner and sent a real estate agent to photograph my lavender while I was supposed to be in Vermont. My daughter-in-law, who had known for 3 weeks and had calculated that the number might make it acceptable. I said, "I want to tell you both something I mean completely." They looked at me. I said, $4.2 million will not make me sell this house. Not because I do not understand what $4.2 million is. I understand it precisely. But this house is not for sale. It has never been for sale. And the method you use to explore whether it might be for sale, going behind my back, using an LLC with Gregory's name, sending agents while I was away, that method tells me everything I need to know about how you see this property. I said, "You see it as an asset." I said, "It is not an asset." I said, "It is where your father planted an oak tree in 1991 that is now taller than the house. It is where you learned to ride a bicycle on this path. It is where I have had 31 years of Sunday dinners and Thursday lunches and difficult conversations at this kitchen table. It is where James drew a garden with lavender and a visiting bird." Lucas said, "I know." I said, "Then act like you know." He said, "I am sorry, Mom." I said, "I know." I said, "Now, Gregory." Lucas said, "Yes." I said, "Patricia's letter goes to him tonight." Lucas said, "I know." I said, "The LLC." He said, "I will dissolve it." I said, "Patricia will confirm that." He said, "Yes." I said, "And the developer?" He said, "Gregory handled that relationship. I will tell Gregory tonight that we are out." I said, "Completely out." He said, "Completely." I said, "Lucas, there is one more thing." He said, "Yes." I said, "The file in Patricia's office." He said, "I know." I said, "It is thicker now." He said, "I know." I said, "It was reviewed in December." He said, "I know." He said, "Mom, is there a point at which—" I said, "Yes." He looked up. I said, "There is a point at which the file stops getting thicker and starts getting thinner. That point is determined by what happens next, not by what has happened before." He said, "What does that mean practically?" I said, "It means that December is 6 weeks away, and 6 weeks is enough time for things to move in either direction." He said, "I understand." Nicole said, "Eleanor?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The Instagram account, the LLC, the loans, the lake house." I said, "Yes." She said, "We have given you many reasons not to trust us." I said, "Yes, you have." She said, "I want to ask you something I do not have the right to ask." I said, "Ask." She said, "Why do you keep the door open?" I looked at Nicole, the woman who had sent 7 sentences from a place of fear, who had come to my kitchen and smelled the lavender, who had published my private life for 4,000 strangers, who had known about the LLC for 3 weeks and calculated that the number might make it acceptable, the woman who kept coming back to my kitchen table. I said, "Because Lucas is my son, and James drew a garden with lavender, and Rose reaches for my pearl earrings every time she sees me, and you walked into my garden on a Wednesday afternoon and smelled the lavender and nodded at me through the window." I said, "I keep the door open because the people behind it are not only this, they are also that." She said, "Thank you." I said, "Do not thank me yet. Earn it." She said, "Yes." They left at 9:40. I locked the front door behind them. I stood in my hallway, then I walked to the kitchen and I looked out the window at the garden in the November dark. The lavender was there, along the back fence, where it has always been, where it will remain. It is Thursday morning. I am back at my kitchen table. Not in Vermont, at my own table, with my own coffee, looking at my own garden through my own window. Patricia confirmed this morning that the letter reached Gregory Marsh at 8:45. His attorney called Patricia at 10:15. He said his client understood the situation and would not pursue further contact regarding the property. Patricia said, "Good." She called me at 10:30. She said, "It is done." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Eleanor, the developer, the 4.2 million." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to ask you something professional." I said, "Ask." She said, "Have you considered it? Genuinely?" I said, "Yes. I considered it on the drive home from Vermont. 4 hours is a long time to think." She said, "And?" I said, "And I am 63 years old, and I live in a house where an oak tree is taller than the roof, and the lavender smells different in the morning, and my grandson draws the garden from memory and gets the lavender right." She said, "That is not a financial analysis." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "Okay." I said, "Patricia, if I ever decide to sell this house, I will call you first." She said, "I know you will." I said, "And it will be my decision." She said, "I know that too. $4.2 million. A photographer in my lavender, an LLC registered 2 months ago, a son who keeps finding new doors into the same room." I drove 4 hours to get home before they finished. I got home before they finished. The house is mine. The oak tree is taller than the roof. The lavender is along the back fence where it belongs. And on Tuesday, James is coming for lunch. He will bring a new drawing. I already know it will have lavender in it. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Has someone ever made plans for something that was yours while you were not looking? Tell me how you found out. Tell me what you did when you got home. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you today, subscribe, because next week's story will stay with you too.